Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm going to be brief, but I'd like to say a few words before we start this series. It was this April, a few weeks after COVID-19 really erupted in our region, that we soon realized that we would have to cancel the international colloquium that we hold in our school every 2 years, and which was scheduled to be held in June. It was Raz, Boaz, myself, and the rest of the colloquium committee found it very disappointing that we could not host all of our distinguished guests here in Tel Aviv, as we always do. While we could not really tell for sure, as we still cannot, when international conferences would resume and whether it is going to be in the near future at all, we nonetheless agreed that in the current moment, it becomes urgent, even more urgent than ever, to discuss the roles that moving images play in our world. As the pandemic has upended so many aspects of our lives without any clear end in sight yet, and as power grabs, upheavals, and protests sweep across the globe and simultaneously leave us all in a transitional period of anticipation to what has yet to come, or has yet to at least fully and clearly materialize, we thought that it would be timely and relevant to invite our international friends and colleagues to lend us their thoughts about any aspect that relates uncertainty to the moving image. Our speakers in this series will all connect their talks to the many possible ways in which moving images and the theory and history of film, television, and media relate to uncertainty. They will attempt to ask what happens when viewers are not sure of what they just saw or heard on screen. What is the fate of film theories that have lost their predictive power? Do and can moving images document that which is unknown or yet to occur, that which exceeds our control, the ambiguous, the implausible? How do film and television deal with reality and history going off script? So each meeting in this series will host one distinguished scholar in our field who will give approximately a 1-hour talk. That talk is going to be followed by a discussion and whenever possible, followed also by a respondent. I am very happy that we're able to kickstart our series this evening with Professor Gertrud Koch, who will speak about the reality of illusion cinema's undecidability. Please stay tuned to our advertisements and our series poster to find the dates for future talks in the upcoming semester and also the one following it. And before we start, I'd like to thank my fellow series committee members, Professor Raz Yosef and Dr. Boaz Hagin, to our wonderful series coordinator, Ms. Diana Galstyan, to Professor Koch for accepting our invitation to be here this evening, for Lewit chairing this session, and to all of you who came. So without further ado, I'd pass the mic to our chair, Ido.
So hello and welcome again, everyone. As Ohad has already mentioned, today we have the pleasure of hosting Professor Gertrud Koch, whom I will soon introduce. After Professor Koch's talk, I will present a short response, and afterwards, we shall open the floor for discussion. Professor Koch, Professor Dr. Gertrud Koch, is Professor Emerita for Cinema Studies at Freie Universität Berlin, a visiting professor at Brown University, USA, and a part-time full professor at Oslo University. She has been a research fellow and a visiting professor in institutions such as NYU, Columbia, Berkeley, Tel Aviv University, and Getty Research Center in Los Angeles. She served as the director of the Research Center Aesthetic Experience in the Sign of the Entanglement of the Arts in Berlin from 2006 to 2014. Professor Koch has written numerous monographs in German as well as in English, an extremely abbreviated list of which would include her book on Siegfried Kracauer that came at Princeton University Press in 2000, her book Breaking Out, Breaking Bad, Breaking Even from 2017, and the very recent Machine that came at Minnesota University Press and that I am very eager to read. She's also the co-editor and on the board of numerous German and international reviews such as October, Constellation, Philosophy and Social Criticism, and others. The title of her talk today is The Reality of Illusion, Cinema's Undecidability. Professor Koch, please.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. I think it's great at least to meet in real time. It's at least one dimension where we have, as Kant says, some senses. I'm very glad that I can present here a topic of my choice. I will speak about illusion and fiction and how this comes together in film. And so on the outlook, it might look like a very old-fashioned paper. But I think in the middle of all this kind of newest skepticisms, it might be useful to just reflect on some of the notions we are using when we are speaking, writing, and thinking about film and cinema. So it's a rather dry exercise. You are invited. So it has a promising title, the first part, Creating Fiction, what I will undo because I hope I don't create fiction here, but maybe conceptual fiction, what would be another interesting topic on a meta level of what we are doing. It's based on a presumption that film has a special need for illusion, that it's built on aesthetics of illusion, and that it brings also this aesthetic of illusion back into the other art. So this would be another part in this project. The space of fiction in a film world is built on illusion. The production illusion in this first degree means, the seeing movement, where it's only, projected stills and so on and so on. You know this. The production of film worlds is made possible by the creation of illusion. To put a variation on Mendelssohn, we can deduce that conscious illusion goes along with the appreciation of the fictional over the factual. The world experienced as illusion is not only recognized as such in its own fictionality, but is also acknowledged as world-bearing. This results in the necessity to clarify the relationship between the real world and the fictional world in the film, and whether this relationship is appropriately captured in the genre discussion between fiction, film, and documentary. Any attempt in this direction is bound to have to take up this historically enduring and contested distinction. It is a popular distinction that not only classifies films according to whether they operate as fiction or documentary. Typically, this distinction is also seen for types of text and literary genres like a novel versus a reportage, and so on, big discussion in the 20s, as you know. And there as well, we can distinguish between factual reports, non-fiction books, and literary fictions. Gregory Curry and many others have rightly pointed out that these distinctions are based more on conventions than on clear definitions of the terms. We do distinguish genres from one another according to their degree of creating fiction. But the fact that we can do this actually requires us to be able to keep the terms separate from one to the other. Either something is fictional or real, and there would have to be reasons given for this judgment. Are determinations of fictional or non-fictional then determinations of qualities of an object that can be true or false? And what are the contextual conditions under which the discursive practices of naming, documentary or fiction, are cultivated, that is, for instance, empirical cultures of knowledge, institutions of fiction productions, etc. So a child might take some fiction for the real world because it doesn't know, doesn't have the knowledge to reject a presented world as, fiction. Cultures are indeed organized institutionally, but they are in debt to rapid shift of modes that are quite unstable. For instance, fictional elements in documentaries are more strongly emphasized today than they were 20 years ago. You can see this with this huge wave of so-called mockumentaries or historical pseudo-documentaries and so. An aesthetic argument has broken out over this question in photography, for example, as well. In this context, for instance, the reception and self-representation of Andreas Gursky's photographic work is interesting. I don't know if you know it. It's this huge photographs taken from institutions like the stock market in Tokyo or in Shanghai. And it's done in a huge format, in a very, I mean, kind of shiny and lacquered way. And there's a kind of technical twist in it. He had long held back information about the significant share of digital post-production in his work until a shift in general estimation had taken place that photography need not necessarily be purely referential, but that digitization could be a benefit to create freedom and technological autonomy. During the transition period, Gursky was attacked because his astounding images were taken as iconic signs of a global alienation, as critical reportage, and not as highly artificial visual commentary on the same issues. The fact that he had not indicated this specific difference from his work was chalked up to being a deceptive maneuver of his part, an argument that has disappeared with the increasing familiarity with the practices and aesthetics of digital photography. So it became part of a shared knowledge that we wouldn't look on a photograph that is digitally enhanced or post-produced as fake, for example. The question of whether this is merely about fluid borders between two technologies, analog and digital photography, or whether ontological divisions follow from this difference, which concern the relationship between sign and referent, leads to the heart of the problem of fiction. Must objects be fictional as a whole, the unicorn, or can they be so only in certain respects? A question that we can pose with regard to a history film or a docudrama, and if it concerns the latter, this in turn raises the question of whether it only concerns aspects of the medium of the distinct, or if the medium of the distinction between fictional and non-fictional is in specific qualities of the object. Furthermore, the question arises as to what the value of aesthetic fictions is in the context of these various fictions. So there's, in fiction theory, there's always this distinction between, different kinds of fictions. And is aesthetic fiction a specific one? How are aesthetic fiction distinguished from non-aesthetic fictions, such as legal fictions or scientific fictions? We speak in mathematics, for example. An example of a legal fiction is property. I can be the owner of a thing without being in possession of it. That is, I have a legal title over an object that I might possibly never have seen or held. An aesthetic fiction, by contrast, is not something I can own, but only generate as a producer and recipient. A scientific fiction, if I buy an art object, I am the owner of a material object described in a contract, but this does not mean that I end up possessing all the aesthetic fictions that form in the minds of others. So I can only have a title of possession of the material object, but not what makes the wit in aesthetic objects is indeed this kind of imaginary space that comes with it. So this I cannot really own. It's not about ownership. An aesthetic, a scientific fiction is an assumption about a fact that I cannot directly prove or observe, a construction by means of which I want to make claims about something, etc. So it's a matter of construction, if you want. An aesthetic fiction, like a model or so, An aesthetic fiction constructs images of the world that have a commenting character and that cannot relate to the empirical world in any way that is remotely similar to that of scientific fictions. So, all these fictions operate on the dividing line between true and false, and or between existent, non-existent. They fundamentally differ from aesthetic fictions, however, in that they are established as hypothetical statements in the realm of the possible, while fiction becomes an as-if reality. So if my car is stolen, it's possible that I gain back the material possession and not only the legal possession of the car, you know. But let's say when I have ordered a design of a car, so I cannot be the potential user of this car. The fiction of ownership is based on the possibility that my stolen piece of jewelry or whatsoever might come back into my possession, and it's not just a legal fiction, but also material ownership. Scientific fiction thinks from the position of probability that something can be assumed to be real, that is possible. But there are also fictions whose relation to the object seems questionable. Is a square root a mathematical fiction or is it material? So this would be some questions you would have discussed in applied mathematics. Ironically, however, most of these doubts do not even arise in aesthetic fiction. The worlds that I see in the film will never become mine. I will never walk around the house and be able to warn the inhabitants about the attacking birds. Also, I have constant access to the film, the birds, at any time, and I can travel to Bodega Bay, the coastal region named in the film, etc. And yet the fictional film exercises an uncontested effect on me without itself needing to be material in the sense of an extensionally unfolded three-dimensional world that I could enter, and without my lapsing into the delusion that Rod Taylor has been waiting for me to visit Bodega Bay for decades. The film itself is a partially materialized fiction. It exists both as a material thing, a DVD, a video, a film print, a copy, etc., and as aesthetic fiction of my perception. As fiction, it only exists in the three-figure relation: the materialized thing, mechanical, the imagined subject of the recipients, and the fiction-forming network of science. Fiction, in contrast to the lie or the promise, for instance, which always make a concrete truth claim and possibly breaches it, is experimental in as much as it necessarily remains open as to how and where allegations of reality or transfers to it are provided for or undertaken. Fiction can function as forming hypotheses both about a possible world and about the concrete empirical world. So this would maybe a way to come to a distinction between the documentary and the fiction film. I understand aesthetic fiction first as those formations of fiction that produce internally coherent figures in a special way and that make truth claims that do not arise from the function of illustration. So film is not an illustration of reality. In the organization of their materials, they open up perspectives perceivable by the senses, which have an effect on my thinking, feeling with their modulations. A film can modulate my ideas about love or hate or whatsoever, or the life of a tribe on Easter Island, without my having to believe in the existence of the characters, or without having to have a complete so-called three-dimensional image of real existing persons, who I could also equally find there. My next point is about virtuality in aesthetic fiction, as I try to discuss in the first part some of the possibilities of how can I come to distinctions. Aesthetic fiction is independent of genre in as much as its epistemological claims are connoted as partial right from the start and aim for the dimension of experience more than knowledge, that is, at the complex liaison of sense perception, emotion, and thought that amounts to the aesthetic experience. Also, I cannot introduce any clear division between different experiences here. I would like to examine the degree to which general definitions of states of consciousness are also illustrated for aesthetic fictions. My thesis is that what Peirce refers to, the philosopher Peirce, to as the virtual of meanings in the stream of consciousness, is valid to a special degree for aesthetic fiction because its telos is anchored in the virtual and not in the possible. Charles Sanders Peirce expressed the difference between something possible and something virtual as follows. I quote, "A virtual X," remarks Peirce while referring to thinking, quote, "is something, not an X, which has the efficiency, the virtus in the Latin sense, of an X. This is a proper meaning of the word, but it has been seriously confounded with potential, which is almost its contrary. For the potential X is of the nature of X, but is without actual efficiency. So the crown prince might be a potential king, but he has not the efficiency of a king. A virtual king in, let's say, in a novel may have this virtuality to act as a king, at least in this realm of fiction. Peirce relates this definition to the temporal dynamic of thought from which meaning is produced. I quote further from Peirce, "Meaning lies not in what is actual thought, but in what this thought may be connected with in representation by subsequent thoughts, so that the meaning of a thought is altogether something virtual." So something that will be developed in time and not so much in material form. The temporalization of thought takes the harshness out of the distinction between fiction and non-fictional, without, however, in the least solving the logical problem relating to the clear distinction between the terms. With the dynamization of meaning, however, the structure within which something is to be thought of as fictional or non-fictional shifts into a temporal horizon that is in principle open. If we take this assumption by Peirce as our basis for a moment, then the thought of something is first displaced as non-fictional on the level of a future action, which in principle is not determined by any individual thought. There will indeed also be distinctions in the structure of future thinking and acting that are dependent on whether something is viewed as fictional or real, but the distinction loses its binary severity. In thinking of a sentence out of the mouth of a character in a novel or a gesture from a film scene, I can easily come to decisions about actions that are at least real in their consequences, but it may be difficult to prove this connection as a monocausal reference. So I speak here in my next part on relativistic realism. And it's not a relativism in the sense of, that I would deny that there's truth or something. It's not my claim here. But that we, refer to the real in relations. It is also necessary, however, to examine whether the performative power of fictions can also be seen in other contexts of activity, or whether they are restricted to aesthetic fictions. In the so-called Thomas theorem, it is claimed that it is enough to consider something real for it to generate the effects that could be expected if it were actually real. Here you have this as if fiction condition. The claim is, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. That's the so-called Thomas theorem. The Thomas theorem was developed in 1928 by the American sociologists Dorothy and Williams Thomas, and since then it has become a central assumption of symbolic interactionism. At core, this sets up the principle that human actions are always based on subjective evaluations of situations. An enthusiastic lottery player reckons with a real chance of winning, even though it is rather improbable that he will win. He acts as if he had a real chance. Also, he usually knows that the statistical probability is low. He considers his luck to be a rare but real entity. His evaluation of reality based on a wish turns him into a player, which has real effects on his financial budget. That's the bad side of this condition. He behaves as if he could get lucky. He interprets the lottery's promise of luck as a future possible reality. In analogy to the Thomas theorem, one can therefore pose the question, what do I have to consider real in a fiction for this to be relevant for my actions? I mean, that's, the question, when does fiction has real consequences for the spectators, for the readers, for the consumers? So what are we taken out of the fictions into our own reality? My thesis is that fictions can supply such as if assumptions with consequences for action. And regardless of whether the story that is told is taken as true, normative interpretations of the situation that are conveyed in them can be accepted as real and can lead back to the world of empirical actions as interpretations. I mean, that's what you sometimes have when you say you come into a situation or building and you say, oh my, it's really Kafkaesque. So it's not that I think that I'm entering the building where Kafka situates his novel on the trial, but I take some of the aesthetic impressions that I got from the novel and transpose them into a kind of real world. So do I fictionalize then the real world, or do I realize the fiction? This is always the tricky question here. If a fictional, and regardless of whether the story that is told is taken as true, it's not that I believe that this are realistic story or, documentaries. And regardless of whether the story that is told is taken as true, normative interpretations of the situations that are conveyed in them can be accepted as real and can lead back to the world of empirical actions as interpretations of the world. If a fictional story about love is understood by the spectator or reader as an applicable characterization of love, the possibility for corresponding self-interpretation with consequences for action in his or her own realm of life is consequently greater than if the fictional events are considered impossible and necessarily unreal. The realm of correspondence can lie within the normative, in a confirmation that something is conceivable because it turns up in an aesthetic fiction and represents a matter of value within the institution of aesthetic fiction. So I can get some normative, let's say, confirmations out of fictions. It's l'éducation sentimentale, it was called in the 18th century. The realm of correspondence can, The modulation of subjectivity starts here, at least on the level of a synchronous emotionality. The indication given by Thomas theory at the level of a sociological theory of action designates the subject perspective of persons as constitutive for evaluating the esoteric content of fictions. It may sound banal, but it is quite revealing where it is a question of claiming that mass media have a causal influence of the behavior of consumers. In his brief study of the reality of mass media, the sociologist Niklas Luhmann describes it as follows, I quote, "Here, the medium of narrative fictionality is chosen to individualize motivational positions. Individuals appear here with a biography, with problems, with self-generated life situations and shame existences, with a need understandable to an observer for suppression, for unconsciousness, for latency. The medium of fictionality has the advantage of being able to bring about, or at least allude to, concrete realities, while at the same time being able to leave it to the readers or viewers whether or not they wish to draw any conclusions for themselves or for people known to them." End of quote. Luhmann describes here the peculiar way in which not only are fictions opened up in the symbolic exchange, but the spectator is also fictionalized in the sense of the subjunctive self-determination. How could it be otherwise, as paradoxes of a simultaneous occurring individualization and de-individualization. The play, and this is part of this, where subjectivity gains objectivity as it becomes part of a setting in a public sphere. The play with identities by persons who no longer have any traditionally or institutionally performed rules for creating identity is taken on by the mass media and their fictionalization. Luhmann writes, "It is extremely tempting to try out virtual realities on oneself, at least in imagination, which one can break off at any time." Luhmann points to the meaning ascribed to the body in the shift from print to visual media. In film, the body and its movements is observable in space. The film thus becomes a medium of intensified body control in which the boundaries of the body are tested out. This is drastically visualized above all in the increasing expansion of areas like action genres, erotics, and sports. This is also, and precisely, we understand films as illocutionary statements, not a matter of an impulse reaction schema conceived as causal and based on mimetic imitation. Rather, a complex network of meanings emerge that, to use Eco's terms, is open, and not any kind of spider's web in which the spectator is an ensnared victim of a direct intention on the part of the producer. The thesis is that the authorial intention that completely determines the spectator in the act of perception is thus not very convincing. Also, it is not possible to rule out that there are works and spectators that look for exactly this kind of authoritarian reference. For instance, training films, propaganda movies, and educational films seek to advocate all their claims and convictions for direct adoption and imitation. So this would be one part on the scale from fiction, documentary, to this kind of, interactionism, what goes, on between the subject and the perceived object. So what then is this virtues of the medium? My preliminary hypothesis is that aesthetic fiction, which qua definition does not function as a factual claim, supplies increased virtuality in Peirce's sense. I would like to examine the thesis, which is in no way surprising on you, by looking at some processes for creating fiction and the outcome of creating illusion in films. First, I will return to a question posed at the beginning, whether it makes sense to maintain the genre distinction between fiction, film, and documentary. In the sense of a broad conception of aesthetic fiction as increased virtuality, documentary film would also count as fictional. for its assertive visual acts are subject to the very same production of meaning as are fictional statements. Documentary films are also edited. They work with camera movement, with off-screen music, excerpts, lighting, and different lenses that orchestrates the entire potential of the film shape, from the panoramic shot, large-scale location shots, up to detail and close-ups. This difference from fiction films is that this difference from fiction film is that the perspective under which I see what is being shown is different, namely that of an interpretive presentation of reality. In principle, however, I can also view every fiction film as a documentary that documents the materials of production, such as sets, costumes, actors, etc. This all depends on the technical requirements for film. The film recording apparatus already consists of a part that is porous to reality, which records or receives in the camera running in real time with its optical lens system that are open to the surroundings, recording light from the surrounding reality, which is directed on inwards by the lens to the inserted film or chip. Where the film is transported by the lens system is in the projecting apparatus. Later during the projection, we see on screen what was recorded in the past as if it were taking place in the here and now. The fictional world of the film is therefore a world that is already temporarily closed, without aging and without death. At most, the material object can change, rot, be distorted by censorship, be contextualized by new background information, etc. Even when I see the film on screen, everything that there is to see can already no longer be seen in reality in the way that I'm getting to see it now. The lights have been prepositioned, the set relocated, the street renamed, the passers-by have long brought their shopping back home, and I won't meet that interesting group guy in the sidewalk cafe anymore either. In many respects, films are time-based media. The location of the camera, the lighting, the actors who may be dead by now, the streets of houses that may no longer exist because they were destroyed, all of this can no longer be changed. The real of the object is its sight as a thing, its nature as a work, its truth, as we can say with Hannah Arendt, for, quote, conceptually, we may call truth what we cannot change. So this would be a very, very basic definition of the factual. But this means that the real in film always appears as fiction. A fiction that can then only be transcribed by new thoughts about the object that is in the mode of the imaginary. The fact that what I currently see in the moving image as present is already past distinguishes film, for example, from music, which is a repetition of the past in the present of the performance in a different sense that in film, which in its thinghood as a material object requires its temporal performance, its mechanical and technical projection, while the musical sound can be heard each time as a different variation on a score or composition and only becomes a reproducible material object itself in the technological medium of a record or CD. The fictionalization of the spectator always only takes place in the screening, when the images end up in movement, therefore spurring an attention that is different than that in front of a static painting, the perception of which I myself can temporarily structure with how I direct my gaze and where I position myself in front of it and in relation to it. The traumatic interruption of the fiction of the living is the basis of the so-called l'arrêt sur l'image, the freeze frame shot, which marks a relapse into photography and is often associated with the horrifying fiction of being the vision of a dead person or of death. So it means of the future as death. This process can show both death diegetically as a figure as well as a current dying of the medium film in its quality as a moving image. So the film dies in front of my eyes when it freezes. I know it's an aesthetic form. It's not that the film will technically freezing. That's totally different than if just, there's a technical failure to project the film. This process can show both which appears to be as a modification of movement. After such a formal moment in a film, it seems altogether as fragile as a Roman slave at the circus who had to greet the Caesar with the formula morituri te salutant. Those are about to die, salute you. I don't know if the correct English translation. The self-reference to the aesthetic temporal indices of the photographic and film image is closely interwoven with the question of the fictionality of film as a medium and independent of the question of the fictionalism of certain genres. The distinction between fictional and documentary film is not solely based on genre rules, but is also dependent on the possibilities of the technical medium, which will still have to be considered later. I can therefore, as already mentioned, see any fiction film as a documentary with regard to a particular actor, the costumes, the shooting location, etc. This doubled coding of recording and projection underscores that often criticized referentialism of the photographic image, which has also been maintained in films shot digitally, inasmuch as they are still based on the optical lens system and the exposure to light undertaken by the camera. What has changed is the storage medium, but not the recording apparatus, from chemical emulsion to digital storage by chips and hard drives. In principle, the light emitted by the physical object is now processed and stored as information and no longer conserved chemically. In contrast to the computer-generated image, most film images remain bound to this dispositif of the photographic. The documentary character belongs to the concept of the documentary film, which is why we would not refer to animated films as documentaries. Even we could argue that there are, models involved and whole scenarios and set designs done and so that there are also material objects, and may it be the drawings that are, filmed by a camera. But we don't do this, and I think it's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as Cavell, who said animation film is not film at all, but there's an interesting distinction to make here. It is more complicated with experimental films even, which move at the furthest end of the scale of the mimetic in relation to the objectification of the apparatus itself, from reportage to prose to poetry, if we accept oblique analogies as a distortion of recognizability. Normatively, this does not in any way mean that only films that maintain this double status should be considered films. Obviously, there are all kinds of films that put their efforts either into undermining this experimentally, for instance, like Kenneth McLaren, who affects unexposed film material with direct manipulation. He writes and draws on the film without a camera, or through animation operations to produce moving images that are either drawn or digitally created. All that we need to note here is that being able to operate in this double positioning of recording and montage is one aspect to the medium film. The concept of aesthetic fiction as an illusion-based emotive perception means more than a theory of identification, conceived as either literary or theatrical, as identification with persons, figures, and situations that prosper into particular plasticity in the visual space of film, enhanced by illusion. Rather, it is about the perceptual conditions of film that are independent of the objects, that is, about the haptic, rhythmic, and synesthetic aspects that contribute to enhanced absorption by the spectator, and precisely not about the properties of simple mimetic illustration. And it's not about similarity, so to say. Christian Metz's famous essay on the impression of reality in the cinema takes off from the psychologist Michaud, who discussed movement as a prop of fiction, as for make-believe, in order to propose a variation on Kendall Walton's suggestion and not so much about the photographic referential. The creation of fiction has such a strong effect because the perception of movement made possible by an objective illusion becomes the signifier of a lived presence that one cannot elude. And as is well known, Michaud demonstrated this aspect of seeing movement by using films with abstract objects and not realistic films. It is therefore, like in music, the temporal structuring of the moving image that plays into creating fiction in the virtual formation of meaning. I mean, Michaud was interested in this narrative structures, the micro narrative structures that come with observation of movement. So what then would be visual fiction? In both the cinema and the theater, we are simultaneously participant and observer. We see how actors play characters and can jump back and forth between internal and external perspective. Sometimes I can observe the body of Monroe or the elegantly manicured hands of Cary Grant. Sometimes I can't have an emotional reaction to a character's set facial expression or see the danger of falling in Thornhill's fingers clutching at a cliff. I quote here from Gregory Curry's essay on visual fiction. There certainly are differences between the emotional power of visual and descriptive fictions. Visual fictions exploit the vast information processing capacity of the human visual system so as to provide us with a wealth of easily assimilated detail. Simply by seeing Cary Grant's hands as he clings to the rock, we are put in a position to make believe that Thornhill's hands are holding the rock just that way. If visual fictions more easily engage us when it comes to the presentation of, say, physical danger, that is because of the way they determine their content, not because their content involves a perceptual relation between the action and the audience. So it's not a question of genre. What we call genre would be kind of meta, how to, present and make experience this formal arrangements. This means that the double coding of film cooperates as recording and a consolidation of symbols in the creation of fiction. In film, the division into participant in a fiction and observer of a screening is increased by the fact that film presents a complex arrangement of perspectival views in the montage of shots. That raises the question of what role the film's perspectivity is accorded in the definition of the fictional. I have previously already pointed out that film, because of the optical system that it is built on, proceeds perspectively, that is, the camera always records particular views. This in no way means that these standpoints must be, should be, or even are seen as possible standpoints of the human body. At most, they are real in the fact that they indicate a possible camera position. This, however, neither has to be realistically plausible through the inner diegetic viewpoints of fictional characters, nor internally ensured through the construction of diegetic space. Rather, it allows the film process to have a perspectival views that are fictional in the sense that they do not indicate any causal relation to the fictional world. I mean, that's a kind of super fictional. My thesis is that the enuncialists vouch for the existence of the fictional world, indeed, as one that exists independently of the participant perspective of the diegesis that is developed, because they say, being gazes from nowhere, do nothing other than interest the spectator in her role as demiurgic observer for what remains to be shown. The trailers for a cinema of attractions are supported precisely by the shots of this non-human gaze, which melts the elementary joy of looking with looking at something. The canonical example of this are two shots from Hitchcock. I quote it here because everybody knows them. The opening shot of Psycho starts with a flying movement that advances from nowhere up above into the window of a high-rise to the bed in the room where the protagonist is laying. It thus combines the anarchically free, undetermined gaze with the targeting view to a scene of a voyeuristic type leading into the heart of the narrative. That's where the story starts. But the exposition of the story starts exactly with this totally diegetic gaze and flight of the camera. And the second canonical example is from Rear Window, where the bored photographer, stuck in a wheelchair with his leg in a cast, lets himself be drawn in by the indeterminacy of a crime that is possibly being carried out before his eyes, but still taking place undercover, pulling him into a story that begins with a spectacular scene. It is therefore precisely the entanglement of causal, inner diegetically positioned narrative perspectives within the fiction, with fictional optical perspectives on a possible narrative that turns the film into a medium of metafiction in the sense of a virtual source of stories. You know, I mean, I would take this flight through of the camera into this window. It's for me a metafiction. It has even, you know, if you remember, an inscription telling the place. So, but you don't take it for a documentary on the city that is named. You take it exactly for a kind of indeed opening shot that opens a real existing world into a fictional space. And this would be, for me, this first, let's say, technique, aesthetic technique of transformation of something documentary in fiction. And so I don't look at this with the eyes of an urbanist who would be interested to look at this of Phoenix in this year, how it looked like from above, you know. So this is for me this kind of metafiction that is has to do with the medium. So that's what, I mean, it makes film interesting for the spectator as a medium of fictionalization. It is therefore, another example is, I don't know if you know this film, Michael Clear's film, Der Riese, the Giant, which edits found footage material from surveillance cameras, providing a soundtrack with synesthetic suggestion so that the spectator is fictionalized in the documentary material. The footage suddenly seems as if they were those opening shots that turn the spectator from observer into the participant in emotive involvement in which the unforeseen is expected, perhaps tensely, namely the transition from the recording into a story that is already being insinuated in the music. So the film shows its surroundings, you know, what an installed observation camera, surveillance camera is recording. And you, I mean, always look for the moment when you enter the crime story. That never happened. But it's again this, the first step of fictionalization, and I think it's an imminent aesthetic operation because it's a fictionalization of the real world or of something that we see as part of the real world. And the fictionalization starts just there in the real world. And that's for me the capacity of film to go with this immediacy in the fiction, in shots that are truly documentary, if you want. Stanley Cavell assumes fiction to be a processual category when he writes, I quote, "One or two of the preoccupations of my book to bear directly, however, on the concept of fiction. The idea of a type, for example, is raised as it's a worldview, the book he speaks about. The idea of a type, for example, is raised as a way of grasping the particular ways in which the human being is fictionalized, which is to say, molded by film. Subsequently, however, Cavell comes to a completely different suggestion, namely, he would like to define fictional as a mode in which something can occur in its narrativity or drama. For film, however, he does not see the mode of fiction as a means of its dramatic or narrative becoming, but the, quote, mythological mode. So it's interesting that Cavell here argues with mythological instead of the fictional. He wants to replace it. It is not clear to me whether this mode is in fact not fictional or rather a particular kind of forming fiction. With regard to film, Cavell understands the mythical mode as a paradox that is created by simultaneously being absent both spatially and temporally, and nonetheless being caught in a highly intensive experience of presence, that of the film. Quote, "They are responding to the fact that I am seeing things not there, experiencing them as overwhelmingly present." End of quote. The mode would be mythic in that it no longer emanates from the difference between fiction, non-fiction, but from the unsettling experience of being unpredictably simultaneously on several levels of space and time, which cannot be logically related to one another. So it would be kind of status of allogicity that I'm sitting, in a seat in a movie theater, and I look at something that is 2,000 miles remote and plays 200 years before my age, and is still experienced by me as an observer as being, of a mythical presence. So that's he calls this interminglement of spheres of time for him, I guess, is a kind of mythical mode and not only fictional mode. Well, it's debatable. Precisely the operation of being able to show a world in which I am involved from the outside creates an uncanny quality that shifts film more into the realm of the fantastic. For unlike mere fiction, it's a mode of appearances, so to say. That's how I translate it. For unlike mere fiction, the fantastic attracts us because it shows us denied or suppressed worlds as being in the world, just as in Poe's story of the murders in the Rue Morgue, which puts the animal excluded from human society into the center of the practices of linguistic attribution, because the only witnesses are those who heard the presumed perpetrator speaking a foreign language. Also, in the end, this turns out to be an ape that is doing the same thing in the world of humans that they themselves do. Therefore, they think it's a foreign language. They don't make the distinction, it's an animal. Cavell connects the motive of uncanniness to perspectivity. I quote, "I relate that idea most immediately to my passiveness before the exhibition of the world, to the fascination, the uncanniness in this chance to view the manifestation of the world as a whole. In another essay, Cavell adds a further building block to his argument. In What Becomes of Things on Film, Cavell defines film precisely in its possibility for undermining the distinction between fiction and non-fiction, relying, among other things, on the aesthetic operations of the surrealist filmmaker Louis Buñuel in Belle de Jour, where the subjunctive of wishing and desiring melds with the indicative of the film image, so that the levels of consciousness become indistinguishable. For the spectator, it remains opaque until the end of the film whether what we have seen is a staged daydream or real events. So we cannot decide it even as we pretend to be inside of the film. So it's nothing that we have no position, no perspective on this from which we can decide if it's a daydream of a protagonist or if it's events that happen to the protagonist. And for Cavell, this is a true cinematic operation. For the spectator remains, the film therefore leads us to a level in which several fictions are already imploding into one another. Either we become mystically visionary at this point or meta-skeptical. In fact, the suggestion amounts to a suspension of the fictional, which can only occur in this way in the medium of film as an aesthetic operation. The complete melding of participant and observer perspective is identical with the human faculty to mix levels of consciousness, such as they appear, for instance, both in Freud and Peirce, albeit with entirely different intentions. Cavell's argument against the fictionality of film can nonetheless be used in support of such a fictionality, since it is based on an ontology of the filmic applied by media, which results precisely from the double coding of indicative and subjunctive, of the indexicality and symbolicity of moving images. If we understand the fantastic not simply in opposition to fiction, but as a mode of the fictional, then Cavell's argument can be completely interpreted as an affirmative response to the fiction debate. We can therefore specify, at least provisionally, the term fiction for film theory. The typical concept of fiction as related to genre must be differentiated according to the medial properties of film, doubled coding of recording and montage. This implies a distinction between institutional and discursive practices of production and reception. Fiction means a processual operation of a double fictionalizing, since a spectator is also fictionalized by reinventing himself in the film. This requires that a tension exists between the empirically possible and the mentally virtual of the symbolic. Not only does the perspectival arrangement of the shots in relation to each other and with respect to the viewer play a decisive role here, but also the possibility of creating illusion as a requirement to intensify fictional events. So this was my lecture. And I guess Ido has prepared a comment on this.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Koch, for this fascinating talk, to which I shall now present my response. I would like to begin by showing a very short clip taken from Preston Sturges' 1941 film, The Lady Eve. Assuming you have managed to watch the clip, or most of you, I shall begin. The production of film worlds, says Professor Koch in her presentation, is made possible by the creation of illusion. At the same time, Koch reminds us that the medium of film stages complex relations between this created illusion and what we may term, for the lack of a better term, the real. I find a concise emblem for this inherent tension of the photographic moving image in a lovely scene from Preston Sturges' 1941 film, The Lady Eve, where, after they went horseback riding, Henry Fonda and Barbara Stanwyck take a break and look at the sunset. Fonda breaks in a romantic monologue, but it is continually interrupted by one of the horses, who keeps nuzzling in, trying to chew on the actor's hair. While the scene is obviously staged, the actions of the animal in it, which could not have been controlled completely, injects the moment with a sort of authenticity and with expectation for some chance happening. At the same time, at any time, the cinematic frame, even that of classical Hollywood cinema, can become infiltrated with contingency. This, of course, has significant implications on the fiction-documentary distinction. Koch maintains that just as fictions are always also documentaries of their own production, if nothing else, so documentaries are edited, they work with camera movement, with off-screen music, lighting, etc. In other words, they are likewise aesthetic constructions. And yet, this aesthetic construction comments on the real in a way that is different in degree, if not in essence, from fiction films. I am reminded here of Robert Flaherty's notoriously staged documentary, Nanook of the North, on which critic Roger Ebert said, "If you stage a seal hunt, it still involves hunting a seal, and the seal hasn't seen the script." Sturges' horse and Flaherty's seal remind us that working with animals in film crystallizes a basic feature in film practice as such, namely that whether documentary, fantasy, or drama, film is placed at the intersection of design and contingency, of fabrication and the real. This intersection of design and contingency, this blurring of fiction and documentary, does not mean that the distinction between the two modes of filmmaking can be disposed of. Indeed, despite the breach of rigid differentiation, documentaries and fictions seem to be operating in different epistemic fields. Koch suggests that the difference lies in, and I quote, "the perspective under which I see what is being shown," end quote. In other words, it depends to a large degree on the context of reception and the epistemic conventions within which each of the modes is understood. Still, when it comes to documentary film as aesthetic fiction, a question presents itself with respect to such practices as actuality films, amateur documentaries, and home videos. Those films generally lack planned mise-en-scène, professional editing and camera works, a musical score, non-diegetic narration, and other markers of professional cinema. What is the status of these kinds of bare cinematic products? Can they also be regarded aesthetic fiction? Do they also supply an increased virtuality in Peirce's sense? And if so, is the degree of which differs from that of professional documentaries and fiction films? Put in more general terms, what is the role of the formal institutional markers of the cinema as we know it in the production of aesthetic fiction? The ability to regard the documentary aspect of any film, what Koch calls the doubled coding of recording and projection, is, according to Koch, maintained in films shot digitally. What has changed with the digital turn is merely the storage technology, not the recording's reliance on light emitted by the physical objects. In contrast to the computer-generated image, says Koch, most film images remain bound to this dispositif of the photographic. Here I find an echo to D.N. Rodowig's claim about the persistence of cinema within new media and the subsistence of celluloid logic in the underpinnings of digital filmmaking. Rodowig, writing in 2007, believes that the digital cinema has not yet broken free from its forefather, and that it is possible that one day and perhaps by now this day has already arrived, digital cinema will come of age, and we shall witness something entirely different than what we know. I wonder what you think, Professor Koch, of whether such a coming of age of digital could potentially impact the function and nature of the aesthetic fiction in the moving image. Finally, I wish to present one more question. Professor Koch asks, what do we have to consider real in a fiction for this to be relevant for our actions? And she suggests that fictions can supply as-if assumptions with consequences for action, and that, and I quote, the possibility for corresponding self-interpretation with consequences for action in the realm of life is greater if the fictional event is considered possible, end quote. My final question then is whether theorizing as such counts an empirical action for that matter. In other words, what are the implications of the degree to which a fictional event is considered possible on the validity of the product of the theoretical analysis of that work? And with this question, I conclude my response and call Professor Koch back to our virtual stage.
Thank you. I was already lost here in the, I cannot go back to the regular Zoom thing. I'm stuck in the, it doesn't matter. So I lost the shared space, so to say. I couldn't re-switch from the clip to the, but it's okay. So I have two things. I mean, thanks first for the comment. And yes, I mean, I'm pretty sure that when digitalization becomes more prominent in filmmaking, and it is already, as we know, most films are already done with at least digital equipment and digital cameras. But that's different from, and I would maintain the assumption that as long as the optical systems and cameras are still working, we have at least a hybrid construction. And with the optical technology, we can entirely leave this realm of a virtual perspectival world. I think that's part of the production in the realm of the optical media. It's totally different when we consider purely digital films that are images based on images. We can even talk if it's images still, done by computers. And as we know, it's still a very, very time-consuming and costful production mode to entirely create a fictional world out of bits and bits, so to say, without pieces. So therefore, I doubt that it will be a near future. As long as we still have this, let's say, in the aesthetics, a moment of this impulse to take the material world as aesthetic material for fictions, I guess the optical illusions will not go away so easily. I even would defend it, and I think it's for me very interesting to observe that in many other art forms like theater and opera and so, you have already a huge impact of these techniques that come with video cameras, and therefore you can say they come already with a different technology. But this technology is again used in a way that makes a static play between recording and projecting. And so the, let's say when the video camera, as Bill Viola explained it, for him, the video camera is the one who is recording, it's not recording any longer, but it's transmitting. And so you have with the digital this opportunity to stay in real time, and that was one of the inventions of television, that you can have this huge transmissions and no longer have to pre-record things that you then project. So the temporality of film is indeed already shattered at this moment. But as I try to argue, that all these aesthetic operations are based on technological possibilities, they are not entirely reduced to them. So it's still not the equipment that makes a film, but with the equipment you can do filmic forms, or one can even go to this old Manovich thesis that the computer will be the medium that can simulate all other media. And so insofar I would say the film as an aesthetic form will stay. The means and the operations and technologies definitely already have changed. But when we define film as this interplay between fiction and a mode of recording or documenting, I think this tension that goes with it as an aesthetic play probably will remain. And this says nothing about computer art. This might be a totally different field. So this would be my prognosis, but who knows? I'm not prophetic here. The other question that I found very, very smart is indeed to bring this discussion back to the writing about and thinking about film. And I think you are entirely right. I would answer it with a yes. I would say yes. I mean, thinking in notions, terms, and categories is a way of taking action. And therefore I would say the aesthetic fictions offer us this kind of worldviews that we can try to take as thoughts of the world and on the world that have a kind of status. I mean, it's the Deleuze argument, if you want, that films are thoughts, and that when we see films, we are thinking also about a world that refers to us, so to say. And it's not about realism in the classical sense that, in realistic forms, the factual world will be imagined in terms of similarity. How can I simulate the world? No, it's a fictional world, and it's as fictional as our thinking is, because our thinking is something that develops in time. And when I think today, what will be the outcome of my practices tomorrow, I'm already in a kind of fiction. I imagine a world that is not yet there. And so one can say that what links film with human action is that it's developing in time as thinking is. And therefore one can argue that there's a centrality of a need for fiction, I mean, not only Mendelssohn, but after Mendelssohn also already the philosopher Kant made very clear that illusion is part of the human capacity to think itself in time. So it's part of this, we develop this kind of illusions also as kind of cognitive tropes. But this would be a little bit different talk, because I'm not so much interested in the cognitive part in it. But I would say, I mean, for Mendelssohn, it's also a moral part in it, that we consider fictional and illusions. He speaks of aesthetic illusions in fiction. So we need this to learn, you know, different modes of action. So, you know, I can learn more in the art fiction, the artistic fiction, than when I try to do everything by myself. So it's a kind of intensification of experiences that I cannot all do by myself. And, you know, life is short. How many deaths can you die? Only one. So it's all that, you know, lives that live to feel and lead to different deaths, for example. We can engage with them in the aesthetic fiction, but not in reality. But it will shape our relationship to life and death, if you want. So that's part of this.
Okay, thank you very much for this. And now, if anyone would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand feature. The floor is open.
I can't raise my hand, so I'll just barge in. I was wondering if I could ask you to talk more about why animation doesn't count as an aesthetic illusion.
What doesn't count as aesthetic illusion?
Animation, whether you could talk more about that.
I would take it as an aesthetic illusion. It was Cavell's argument. He argues that
it's not film.
Huh?
Yeah, sorry.
No, he argues that while animation is no longer in this mode of you know, an automated world projection, but is drawing. So he would say this is not film; it's drawing. It's fine art, so to say. I think it's not a good argument. So in contrary, I would say that in animation, you have an enhanced version of illusion, because all that is developed there is working with kind of illusionistic tricks. You know, when you look at the William Kentridge films or so, the animation things, it's always very specific and original developed technologies to do the trick, so to say, to bring things into movement. So I wouldn't, no, this wasn't my argument. I tried to counter Cavell's argument, and I think he's self-contradictory there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments?
Ori?
Thank you. Thank you for this rich talk. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the larger context that it sprang from. Why were you interested in that now? As you said, you're coming back to it's a time, it's a subject that has a lot of let's say history, and does it have anything to do with post-truth field of your questions, or is it unrelated? Tell us a bit more about the context.
Yes, so I mean, the context is that I'm doing for years some projects on the question what illusion plays a role in film or for film. And so I have a book that was in German. It's part now of the English translation. I hope it will come out sometime. So let's say for me, the initial question was indeed one that reflects the use and the practices of this kind of videographing on the stages in theater and opera. And I found it very interesting that in all other arts and film, they would claim a kind of Brechtian status that they are anti-illusionary. So illusion would be seen as a kind of, papier-mâché from the 19th century. And I was interested in looking again at this notion and see how far one can go in, let's say, reshaping this concept. In analytical philosophy, I mean, there's a kind of preference to say, we don't speak anymore of illusion, we tell it, we name it today imagination. And I have also an argument against this because I think that the moment of optical illusion, objective optical illusion in film is very strong. So with all training, we are not able to see 24 stills in each second of a film projection. We can. It's our limit in our physical thing, or you can say it's a performativity of film that it can make things look like moving. And so I think this basic operation that film is not sharing with other arts is very specific. And from there, I wanted to look, is film enabling a different aesthetic of illusion that comes definitely as film comes from the end of the 19th century in this, full area of aesthetics of illusion, but it transforms it already. And for me, it was, and therefore I'm now writing and preparing another book that goes more for this technical question. So why is film so dependent on all these kind of technologies, and how are these technologies used? And when I go to the digital, you can see that even the digital in more conventional films are mostly used to create again this kind of, the naturalistic world of science fiction, of fantasy, and so on. So it's again based on a construction of world, of kind of worldliness, of the representations in moving images, that is interesting for me. And so therefore I wanted to go back and to discuss also in philosophical terms what illusion designates. And you have this, very different notions of illusion. And the most common notion is that illusion is fake. It's self-deception, And I would say that this is not the question in the concept of illusion in aesthetics. And so therefore, for me, it's part of an aesthetic theory of film that includes the technical side and the poetic techniques, if you want. That's a project in which this part is embedded. So I was really interested in why is it, you sit, for example, here in Berlin, there are huge theaters. It's a theater city. And so you sit there with 1,000 people in one immense space, and you have a stage with really interesting actors and actresses. And you look for big parts of the time, you look at a screen where you can see a close-up of a shoe or of a face of the same real objects that are on stage. So what makes it so, it's a discursive aspect also, what counts as an image? And why is it hardly more attractive to look as a moving image than on a moving actor? this fascinated me. I said, that's interesting. You know, that now theater is engaging with these moments of illusion in order to invest, so to say, in this capacity of illudation of the spectators. And they became very, very virtuoso in doing this. You know, it's a technique where a videographer is all the time on stage or behind stage and follows the actors. It's a choreography. So you can bring it also in terms of dance, and in dance, it was very early on used to have computer, you know, accompanied directings in choreographies. And so William Forsythe has done it when he was the ballet director in Frankfurt. And so I was very much influenced by this, let's say, stealing technologies, practices, bringing into a totally different environment and starting there again. So they brought something to the theater, but maybe also to film. Because this whole question of what is, you know, this animation, why are we so animated when we are in a mediocre film? We sometimes are much more animated than when we are in a highly abstractifying mise en scène in a modern theater. So how comes that this quality is still so big? So far you can say it's a defense of cinema as part of the future of all the other arts also. So this was the frame, that was my question. It was done in this huge research project on the aesthetic experience, where we worked, you know, interdisciplinary with musicologists, with people from literature and a lot of art history and so, and huge parts of our film science, film studies department. So this was a kind of question that was interested for everybody. For example, it's very hard to say, is there illusion in music? But back to the animals. What would be also interesting regarding the comment and the clip, I unfortunately have not seen the clip. My computer didn't produce it. But I mean, what's the interesting thing is here that animals are brought into film as this mega signifier of something real, e.g. more nature or what. So that's interesting. So it came up in the comment twice. So now the first example was the horse, and this I found amazing. And you know, I had, and the second was the seal. And in my paper, I discussed the Edgar Allan Poe, the ape, who were seen as a foreigner over the sound.
Right, and I think, I mean, of course, it's true about animals, but in a way, it's true also about mega stars. I mean, of course, people like Klaus Kinski or, you know, idiosyncratic actors, they bring their own idiosyncrasy or vitality, but it's true also about Barbara Stanwyck or any star persona is also brings an aspect of the real in the same manner, I think, as an animal.
Absolutely. This is what I mean with this double coding. You know, when I go to a theater, mostly I don't look so much. I see much more a kind of fiction. a role, you know. And in film, you have this, I mean, body reference that makes it very interesting, that you cannot abstract from the body. And it's part of the game. I mean, let's say that Hollywood actors have this body doubles who play the erotic scenes or the dangerous scenes and so on. And it doesn't break the fiction. I mean, it's no 1 second where you think, oh, is it now really or is it a body double? So this shows us, I mean, how willing we are to take part in the fictionalization, what I call the illudation. You know? And it's not that we are too stupid, that we don't understand that it cannot be real. It must be a body double. It's too dangerous. You know what in this film by Tarantino, what was it? Crash. You know, was this real double stuntman complains about the digital, that now they don't need any stuntmen because they can just, you know, go to a technical replacement. And but the fascination is still in this moment that it's a real body. And that's how film started. I mean, the old comedians, stand-up comedians, they didn't have any body doubles. They were very artistic, acrobatic even. So it's insofar I think it fulfills this claim that film has still this materiality in it, that it's related to objects and things that are factual or material.
Any other thoughts, questions, and comments?
I do have one more. I was wondering a bit about the framing and nesting of one medium inside another that you mentioned now. What would it be like to see a film stage play, for example, in your theory? Which is something I do now because theaters are closed. Would it have the same impact as a film?
I think the impact is always a different one. I mean, it depends on, let's say, the medium of reception. We are speaking here about at one side of the medium of production and how this has changed, how, let's say, a video camera invades a theatrical space and replaces some of the, you know, body features of the actors. And then we can speak about the replacement of the spectator that is, you know, drawn out of this real space and real time into this consuming pre-recordings. I mean, what we can, you know, it's only weeks, I guess, until we will have the first big analysis of this kind of Zoom interactions. Where it is also not quite clear what the basis of this interaction is. I mean, you still can say we are in real time together, but not in the same space. And still this has enormous impacts on communication and so. And I must say I'm trying to destroy it because I never shut down my microphone so that I can still do nasty remarks. But it's not what you are supposed to do. You're supposed to shut down your microphone when others speak so that you make it into different shots where you have a moderator who is a kind of director who will, I mean, you reopen the possibilities that you enter the spaces. So I think it's a very complicated maneuver of directing that is going on there. And I guess partly these experiences will go back to the theater and then to film and to everywhere.
Thank you. And I think we have another question from Gilad.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much. I was wondering if I understood correctly. You were saying that film is film as an aesthetic is on the intersection between the real and the fiction and the fictitious. So basically, what I wanted to ask is if, let's say, one day the camera as a physical object is abolished and everything is abolished, but still using motion capture suits, movement is dragged as a reference, as a referent of the real, of something, of a motion capture stage. Would that still entail that aesthetic, that aesthetic fiction, so to say?
Yes, I mean, I just, Ido mentioned it in the beginning. I had this booklet on the machine, and there I argue with exactly with this kind of motion capture techniques and how they are built to even enlarge this inherent filmic capacities to produce a fictional world that has this virtual character of, giving us the impression that it is real. And it's, I mean, when you even look at the developments in the 3D technologies, for example, Avatar, I thought it was a really very, very interesting film, because it was maybe the first film who managed to use the 3D technology in this kind of enchanting way, that you really had the impression that a butterfly would sit on your shoulder, so that the film object enters the space of the spectator. So I think it was really very well done and much better than other 3D films, where you still have more the impression that it's a hologram. But there it was really a move into, it's the old Eisenstein dream, that the image would reach into the space of the spectator and, grab him or enchant him or whatever it can do. So yeah, I would say that this is a part of what I would all call as aesthetic illusion in film. And it has to do with this, how to animate the spectator. And it's also interesting that, I mean, this in Avatar, you have also, it reflects also in the narrative. What I thought was also the first film in which this dream was subverted. And, in most films about artificial intelligence and avatars and robots and so, it's this pure robots who want to become humans. And in Avatar, it's the engineer who want to become an avatar. And I think that's indeed, for me, it was kind of, a kind of homage to cinema, to say, yes, we want to be the avatar. We don't want to be, when we go to a film, we don't want to be, the one we are when we leave the film. So it's, for me, this comes together with this capacity of aesthetic illusion to bring the spectator into the object and not the other way around.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
More questions or comments? Ohad.
I have a comment about contingency in relation to the moving image and how much it's inherent to fiction. And I think the example that Ido gave is wonderful. The Lady Eve, it reminded me also of what Sobchak speaks about when she lays out the example of Jean Renoir's Rules of the Game, and how the hunt suddenly becomes the eruption of fiction, or the penetration of non-fiction into the fictional space. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of blurs the distinction. And also very much as you say, Ido, yourself, very much dependent on reception, on the context of reception. But since documentary is basically an aestheticized form of fiction in a certain way, and Ido mentioned the example of Nanook, I was wondering if we can also think perhaps about contingency in documentaries, moments whereas within the construction of documentary, there is this contingent moments that come as a surprise. Whether that starts from the very early Lumiere films that we notice the leaves in the background in the middle of the breakfast, but also when Agnes Varda, forgets the lens cap on her camera, or when the sound is not working for Ross McElwee in Sherman's March, and you have these wonderful contingent moments within nonfiction.
Yeah, I would entirely agree. And so that was my, let's say, my argumentative strategy to say, I don't discuss this as a binary opposition, but on a scale. And the scale between documentary and, let's say, digital animation would be the distance it has to the world surrounding the camera. And you can say that the documentary that fascinates us is usually working exactly with filmic props, like the close-up, to make an emotion of a speaker more experienceable and so. But also what I started with was this kind of, panorama shots. That is also very important in documentaries. I mean, they want to locate something. And so maybe one could also arguing that for documentaries, space and place is a very, very important thing. While you can say in narrative modes, it's much more about the timing, how something develops in time. And so I don't know, one has to look at this. When you look at, say, at Frederick Wiseman films that are very long, they are very kind of, elaborated. They really have a fine cut. So there's a specific rhythm in it. And so it would be also interesting to compare documentary rhythm. Is there something like this? Are we, when we look at a documentary, we are not expecting, let's say, car races or extreme speed or so. Depends on the subject, but usually, I mean, this wouldn't be the place to do it. And I guess there develop things more that would go back to this rhythms in everyday life and the capacities we can do. So maybe one could argue that in the documentary, when we go back to the scaling, that there's a scale also from possibility in the virtual. You can say that the documentary tries to look through the virtual to the possible. So it's a world that would much more solidify itself, not like Belle de Jour, where the whole film is about, nullifying the difference. And I think a documentary would always look for signs that would enable the spectator to accept that this is about a world that exists outside. I can have a different view on this world, but I wouldn't have a split with the film, so to say, in the acceptance that this world exists. If a documentary would invent a world that doesn't exist, it would either be a lie or a mockery. So you could argue that there are different modes of instating and initiating a worldview. And in fiction, you would have already this kind of, unrelated opening shot that shows you a world you know already it's a fiction. Whereas a documentary usually would start maybe with a similar thing, but I guess it would be much more related to a possible human viewpoint. The helicopter, when it's done from a helicopter, you would see the helicopter. But one has to discuss this more with films. I mean, to see really how it works and when is this moment of skepticism entering the experience of a documentary, where you think as a viewer, this might be very much staged also. As we know, a lot of, even Nanook was a lot of staging in it. Maybe not the seal, but the humans are always players.
Any other thoughts? Anyone? Okay, if we don't have any other comments, please join me in thanking again Professor Koch for joining us today, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and hope to see you soon.
Yes.
Wherever.